So welcome back to DC Thursday, everybody. I'm Pete Soderling. I'm the founder of Data Council and the Data Community Fund. And I'm here as your guide through the vast, sprawling, expanding modern data ecosystem. And as you know, we have highly interesting and engaging guests on this show, and today is no exception. I'm very pleased to welcome Dane Sundstrom, who is most importantly a fellow Minnesotan, and also the creator of both Presto and Trino, or the co-creator. I should give proper credit where credit's due. Currently, Dane is the CTO at Starburst Data, and he has a very rich past in software engineering, dating all the way back to his JBoss days. I found Dane to be a wealth of information and fun stories on the tech software engineering ecosystem from the past 20 years. And today we're going to discuss some of Dane's insights, including the one that led to the creation of Presto while he was an engineer at Facebook. And we'll also hear about some of the key architectural decisions that were made when creating that project. We'll also learn about Dane's current work at Starburst and learned why he joined the company that he believes has the best shot at becoming the heir apparent to Presto. So Dane, I want to thank you for joining us and welcome to DC Thursday.
Thank you. It's great. It's great to be here.
So Dane, you have an illustrious background. You've served as a software engineer at many companies, many known companies, Proofpoint, Ning, IBM, Facebook, obviously now Starburst. I kind of want to get the early scoop from you. How did you get into software engineering?
So, funny story. I knew how to program as a kid, but I never did it. Programming was I had a Commodore 64, so you had to write a small program to launch a video game. That was why I learned how to program, right? But I got to college and my mom was like, "You're not taking enough credits. Why don't you take this Pascal course?" And I took it and I was like, wow, this is the easiest thing I ever did. It's super interesting. I did really great on all my assignments. I was like, great, I'll take more of this. And then a few years I found out actually this is a real big career, which is dumb because this was the mid 90s, but I was, a kid not really paying attention to things. So from there I went and worked at United Healthcare, and I was it's again, lucky and blessed because I didn't go to the normal United Healthcare. I have a bunch of friends who work there. I worked in the division that wrote the tools for everyone else. So I wrote the tools that did Intera DCE, which is a precursor to Corba, and I knew how to do Windows programming, which none of the other old Unix guys did. So I would do the Unix program. I would do the Windows programming and integrate into. There was these old weird programming languages that were kind of Visual Basic, and you had to integrate your RPC system into it. So that's how I ended up learning RPCs and distributed computing and distributed transactions and two-tiered systems and things like that. And this was 97. And so this is pre-EJB, pre all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually why I ended up working on stuff at JBoss.
Yeah, so
I knew how to do all this stuff.
So talk to us about that, because the early 2000s were sort of formative years, I should say, in the EJB Java community, and you ended up working on a couple of the prominent application servers of their time. How did that happen?
So after United Healthcare, I went and worked at a startup, and then I started doing consulting, and it was the boom, right? So I was a very young kid, and at the time I would bill people I don't know, $175, $200 an hour, and then I'd go and work 80 hours a week because I was a kid, And then there was the bus started to happen. I was like, this is exhausting. I'm gonna go do something. So I'm I'm gonna go write a video game. So 2 weeks later, I'm working on JBoss because I'm obviously a video game needs a a distributed computing system in the back end. Again, like stupid kid, right? And I'm like, can't afford to pay for WebSphere, so I'll just go watch JBoss stuff. And I started using it. I was like, this thing's super broken. So, and this was back when they were called JBoss. And it was like Mark Fleury and like 4 other people, like, you know, the Jetty guys, James Strachan, and you know, but like it's funny because like all those folks, they left and they're like luminaries, but you know, and everyone's like, how do you know these guys? And I'm like, well, back in the day, the Java community had like, I don't know, 100 people in the open source who like, we all knew each other. Like, you know, I remember when James Duncan wrote Ant, and we're like, this is great. This is so much better than using make files, right? And so like all those people started working together. So I started working on their container managed persistence, which is, they don't have that anymore, do they? Like,
I have not tracked the Java world, so I'm not sure. I remember Ant though.
Yeah, so they used to have this thing. It was like a mapping tool. It's like an ORM mapping tool, but it was like really based around like distributed computing concepts. So it's like the worst design. Anyways, they had a terrible implementation. So I rewrote that, and then I wrote their. It had a query language in it, which was kind of looked like SQL. And so I wrote the world's worst parser and analyzer, and like would translate the system. And a few years later, someone came along who knew what they were doing and rewrote it. And I learned a lot. I learned definitely how not to write a parser and analyzer.
Funny. And what was the trend? How did you end up working on both JBoss and Geronimo? Like how did that happen?
So, I mean, there's a long history with Mark Fleury. Like, he is not the best business guy. And so a bunch of us had been working with Mark, and he was running these like training sessions, and wasn't really paying people what he had promised. And we all went to some conference in Vegas, and we're in the bus going back to Vegas, and someone's like, yeah, what's going on with this? And then we all got talking, and we decided that no one wanted to work with Mark anymore. So we all split off. And so it was like myself, the Jetty guys, James Strachan and Hiram Trino, and a bunch of these other people. And we formed our own group, and we started working on a new system. And that eventually became Geronimo at the Apache Software Foundation. The Apache guys recruited us to work on it there. So it was, again, this is like the days when things were a lot smaller. Like you go to Apache now and they have like 1,000 projects or something. I don't know. Maybe they don't, but it feels like it. And so like everyone,
maybe they do.
Yeah. So again,
well,
we wrote everything from scratch.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I definitely want to get to the Facebook and Presto story, but before we do that, you had a couple other companies in between, Proofpoint and Ning, for sure. Were you working on any like meaningful data stuff in those companies, or I'm kind of curious as the transition, you know, from the Java world into sort of the more data world? What did that look like for you?
So eventually, like we sold. We did a startup and we sold it to IBM, and I worked at IBM for a few years, and then I got really bored with that. And I had a bunch of friends who were at this company Ning, and I was like, great, I'll move up to Palo Alto and work at this company Ning. And Ning was a social networking company, and I learned a ton of stuff around how you actually build web scalable systems. And this is this is early web scales. So like this is like, it was not even really cloud-based. Everything was running on-prem, but they built a cloud-based like system. So, and then at Ning, I also spent a lot of time like in my free time digging into data systems. Like I rewrote Memcached in Java. I rewrote some like Berkeley DB and a bunch of other things. then when I left Ning, I went to Proofpoint, and I still continue. Like I still have a fork of like Level DB that someone has forked for me because I'm not a very good maintainer and very busy. So I started doing a bunch of data stuff there. But really what I worked on at Ning and Proofpoint was building a platform for like distributed computing in a modern web style. And so we built this thing called the Proofpoint platform, which later became Airlift after we left Proofpoint and went to Facebook. And then we built Trino on top of that because that's what we knew.
Yeah, got it. Yeah,
Sorry,
that's got it right. Presto. So that transition from you know, what we were doing before to web scale is definitely something that I think caught a lot of engineers off guard, especially if you weren't really working in the Bay Area. Did you move to Palo Alto to sort of take that job at Ning, or where? I'm just curious where you're physically located when you're working for IBM at the time.
I was in Santa Monica. It was awesome. I lived like 5 blocks from the beach. Get up in the morning, go surfing, and like it was great. But at the time, I don't know. I hear LA has like a scene now for programming, but like basically, unless you wanted to make like firmware for landmines, you were in the wrong city. Like there was like a small Google office, but it was tiny, like, you know. So there was like hardly anything going on in LA. And I was done working on the stuff with IBM, and everyone was remote. And I was like, I want to work in an office with people. And I was like, great, I'll move up to the Bay Area. And wow, like, you know, you walk into the coffee shop here and it's like there's Whit Diffie sitting there. Like it's just a different world, you know?
Yeah, sure is. Well, that's great. So you got in the web scale game, Ning, Proofpoint. How did you end up at Facebook? Like what's that story?
So we were at Proofpoint and like decided like they made a decision that they were going to like, you know, have a new product person which was going to run stuff, and it just wasn't very interesting anymore. So we had this friend from Ning, Sam Rash, who was at the data group in Facebook, which wasn't very big. Like they had built like this system to like stream all the data in their warehouse, and he was trying to recruit us. And eventually Martin Traverso was like, great, I'll talk to him. And the old VP of Eng at Ning was the VP of infrastructure at Facebook, Jay Parikh. He then became the VP of Eng at Facebook. And so like both of them were like recruiting us. So like we got tons of interesting stuff in Java because we're like, why would we want to work there? Like we're the Java experts. Like I don't want to like work on PHP stuff. And they're like, all our data stuff's in Java. They had recently lost like the entire Hive team, so they had like no one to run their stuff. They need leadership, so they hired us, and we worked on some of that data streaming stuff, like the real-time processing of real-time streams. So Facebook had like a very early version of this stuff. And after a while,
you mean when Twitter was working on Storm and sort of that era?
Yeah, when Twitter rolled out Storm, Facebook had a much better version. But this is one of those problems. Like stuff at Facebook is like very hard to open source in those days. Well, and not because of Facebook, but because of like politics, but because the software is like, a lot of these big companies end up being like building these like Frankenstein pieces of software where they're like, they use everything the company already has, and like the vast majority of it can't be open source. This is why you don't see a lot of stuff from Google. It's just too hard to like separate it out, and no one's going to give you a budget to build everything from scratch. So like you have to lean on other people's stuff. So like they were all upset, and like, well, I mean, like they push something out, it works. So and so we got asked to replace the system that Facebook team had built at a hackathon. They built a system in C++ that could query Hive data. and it was used by a ton of people, and it was very fast. And so they used it for interactive analytics, but then those people quit, and I don't know, they were going to do a startup or something like that. So we were like, hey, can you guys maintain this, whatever? And we're like, we have to rewrite it because we're not C++ guys. Later, we found out it was fast because it didn't process all the data. It had optimizations where it would process for exactly 5 minutes and then be like, that's close enough.
Okay.
And it would do things like, after you have 1,000 groups or 10,000 groups in your group by clauses, that's enough groups. So they didn't do any of the hard stuff. Everything was like these heuristics. And we're like, we need to build a database. It has to return correct answers. So we had worked at places where they had these heuristic systems. And the problem is if you don't have perfectly correct answers, people learn to not trust the data and the answers. And therefore, once trust is gone, you cannot get it back in your data systems. We learned a bunch of lessons around we worked at this place where they forked the data and they put one in a database and one in a Hive system. Same data, right? But each one loses data slightly different, or they have slightly different ways of calculating. So someone will run a system over here, run one over here. Which one's correct? You can burn infinite amounts of resources in that. So one of the first things we did when we built Trino, or Presto, one of the first tenets was the answers will always be correct. There is no compromise on that ever. And that was a pretty bold statement at Facebook, shockingly. A bunch of the other decisions we made were we're going to do ANSI SQL. People were mad for years. They're like, why are you not doing Hive? We have to learn a new system. And we're like, Facebook literally doubled in number of employees every 2 years. And we're like, hey, people know ANSI SQL. There's standard tools. We can hook up to it. And in 4 years, there'll be, 5% of the company will remember we had this conversation. Still took them. They were still mad the whole time. They're probably still mad.
And so
it was the right decision.
So you're saying the original Presto came out of this Hive, this sort of system built around Hive to, did you say it was to import or ingest Hive data into Hive?
So the system at Facebook was a fast interactive system that could do just aggregations over a single table, no joins, no nothing. So one of the things that we made this decision when we went early was we had a lot of experience with traditional databases like Netezza and Teradata and MPP systems. And when we looked at Hive and all the other stuff in the data space, we're like, this is just the wrong approach. MPP is the right approach. MapReduce is not the right approach for SQL analytics. There's too much of an impedance mismatch. So we're like, we're going to build a new MPP system. We're going to customize the storage because we knew storage optimization is the golden hammer of analytics, because we used Netezzas and we saw what could do if you customize the storage to exactly match the compute. And so we're like, okay, we're going to build a custom storage system. So big, bold plan. We had 4 people. And we're like, great, let's start by making the compiler system and the execution engine. So we did that. And we're like, okay, we're going to need to build a system to import data into this, because we used, again, Netezza, and we're like, the worst part is getting data into your database. It's a terrible product. So we built these tools to import. And then at a hackathon, we're like, let's just try and query directly over this import tool. And it was super fast, shockingly fast. And so we decided that for now we'll just go over this import tool. Later we'll build an ingest system. And we never really got back around to that because it worked so much. And so if you look in the Trino code today, you'll still see a thing called the Hive client, which was the Hive ingest client. And we had the MySQL ingest client. And so you still see these lingering things throughout. And it in retrospect, it was kind of this dumb idea that we would import data, because at the time Facebook had, I don't know, hundreds of petabytes of data or something like that. Now they have insane amounts. And you're like, I'm going to create a second copy of this just for like another storage system. And like, this is actually really common in the industry now. You still see this where it's just like, oh, import your data into my system. And it's like, no one, like, it's hard to do. It's expensive. Like, and just, you can query it directly. Like, obviously, if you organize the data better, the performance goes up significantly, but you can do that in a object store system if you're clever.
And so did that change the direction of Presto then? Like, was that an insight that sort of fundamentally changed the way you thought about this query and the storage system and the query engine on top of it?
Yeah, so the two big changes were, we had to have this abstraction when we were starting to import stuff. And so that meant that we had actually abstracted the storage away. We always kept the storage away from the query engine. It was just a thing we did. And therefore, we could run the query engine over really any storage. And that's how we ended up with what people now call mesh, data mesh. Trino had always been built to do that. Presto had always been built to do that. And we did it at Facebook because Facebook had data silos. It's funny because it's like Facebook had all these problems like 5-10 years before everyone else did. And so like you'd have a data silo that was like the feed data, and the feed people wanted to be able to run queries over the Facebook data feed to find people like gaming the system and things like that. There's just like no way to do it. We hooked it up to Trino or Presto in like a week, and they were able to like find a bunch of fraud and stuff like that. We hooked up all of the MySQL storage systems and a bunch of other things, so like people could start joining data across these, and it was just like a huge game changer. And that it was really fast. Like in those days, I don't know what Hive's like now, but in those days, like you'd run a Hive query and it would literally, our system would email you when it would finish. That's how long it took. Like you'd go get a coffee.
Well, I remember you saying something to me previously about how there were other reasons that moving data around at a company like Facebook just became a non-starter. And it wasn't purely for the technical annoyance of having multiple copies of data. There were other pressures that started to emerge in an org that had so much data.
Yeah, you literally can't afford. So everyone's like, oh, Facebook's got infinite money. Okay, sure, but there's effectively infinite data, because any engineer can add to a system and they generate lots of data. So like you have lots of data, you're like, great, I want to like ingest that data. You have this problem, like you only have so much floor space in your data centers. You only have so many data centers. There are only so many hard drives in the world. So you're like, great, we bought all these hard drives. Then there's like a tsunami in Thailand and you have to replace every hard drive. So like they bring in truckloads of hard drives, and like it's really complicated. So like everyone thinks that there's like these big companies have it easy, but with the bigger size comes bigger data. And so like you have the same problems, just bigger scale kind of things. So it's like, oh, there isn't enough storage. There was never enough storage. There were never enough computers. Every time we'd onboard new resources, the internal people would use all of them. They're getting more and more insights, which is like, it's great to have a valuable product, but at the same time, if you don't have enough compute, everything slows down. So like we had to build these big systems to like ration compute. And this is like, you're rationing compute and there are literally like 10,000 plus machines running this thing. And you're like, I could use 10,000 more, but even if you wanted them, where would you get them? Where would you get the electricity? Where would you get the floor space? You have this problem that the interconnects between buildings are really expensive. So the storage and the compute has to be in the same building, or you have to buy interconnects that are hundreds of millions of dollars. Like it's just like, it's one of those like, 5 years ago, I was like writing systems for like, oh, they got a big system. They have like 5 computers. When we showed up at Facebook, we're like, oh, we need a test system. And we're like, we need like 2 or 3 VMs. They gave us a rack of 30 machines, and we're like, what am I going to do with 30 whole computers? That's an insane number, right?
It's very
And
funny
by the end,
because
our
no one
test
talks
system
about
was,
no, go ahead.
go ahead. I would say at the end, our test system was 500 machines dedicated just tests, because that was our scale test for the 10,000 machine installation. Like, it's just weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess no one talks about the logistics of moving bits around, but you know that's a real thing, especially at that kind of scale. There must have been legal concerns and compliance concerns and all that other stuff as well that would come into moving data around. If not then, definitely now. You know, so these things are causing more complications as well.
Yeah, the amount of compute that goes into data anonymization goes into like I don't know if they have sovereignty problems at Facebook. I know lots of customers, like we have customers who are like, this data has to stay in this country, this data has to stay here. That's a real deal. At Facebook, a huge portion of compute time, something like 10% or something, maybe more, went into like, as new data showed up, scanning it to see if it contains PII. Because like when you have that many employees, people don't tag data correctly. And so you're like, oh, this has PII in it. It needs to be tagged because it has to be anonymized and masked. And like, you know, when you're at a small company, you can be like, we'll just have people review it. But at some point, you're just like, to meet our regulatory requirements, we have to write automated systems to find this. Like, people aren't good enough for it.
Right.
And it's, yeah, it's like more data, more problem. The bigger you are, the more problems you're going to have. Which is why, like, it's really important to have all of this stuff as you're going through the stages, like making sure that everything's automated. Because as you grow, like the next stage is going to be this new set of problems. You're like, what? Since when is that a requirement?
Yeah, I get it. Well, before we move on from Facebook, anything else interesting there that that you want to share about your time working there?
I don't know. It was a great time. Like it's fun starting a new project. Like you have like a small set of really excited people to work on stuff. It was like a really, really great experience. They had really great setup when we first started working on the project. Like we were able to, like, you know, we showed up and we're like, we'll build this database system, but we're not doing it unless it's open source from the beginning. Like we're a database, and in our estimation, it took 10 years to get a mediocre database. And I think we did better than that, but we're at just about 10 years now, and it's pretty good, right? We had a bunch of advantages, and it's like, I'm not going to work on something for 10 years and have it literally die inside of a company. So we went to the VPs and we're like, hey, we'll want to do this. Let's do an Apache license so anyone can use this. Like, it isn't trapped at this company, because like Facebook and all of these companies, they change their mind. Like, even if it's awesome, it's like, we don't need that anymore. We're going to do something else. Like, I mean, I've seen big companies using open source stuff, and now they're on BigQuery, you know, and like their internal stuff just dies, which is like, it's fine. These are like good business decisions. But as an engineer, like, it's really, really hard if you've ever worked on something and just seen it just die internally. It's just sad. So
you knew that you wanted to and had to fight this open source battle sort of preemptively at Facebook, because it didn't have a great culture for open source. So you chose to make sure and to sort of you know, use whatever social capital and political capital you had to make sure that this project was going to be able to be open source from near the inception, it sounds like.
Yeah, so that experience came from like part of it was, you know, my experience at JBoss, where I saw what happened when like a company started to take control of an open source project. So we tried to build a community such that we wanted the developers involved in the community to run the community. And we didn't want like politics around like a big group like Apache. And we worked really hard to like build a diverse community because we didn't want it to be completely controlled by Facebook. I learned at IBM, like, you got to ask for everything up front. At Facebook, we asked and they were like, that's a great idea. We want to disrupt the data analytics space anyways. So like, let's do it. Right. But we had to ask for was, we're going to build this from open source from scratch. And that means like, we're not going to reuse a bunch of this internal stuff. And again, people were mad because like at these big companies, especially as like Facebook went from this, there's tons of interesting problems to like every interesting problem has a team on it. Right. And then there's fiefdoms and everyone wants to be involved and expand the scope of their projects. Right. And so like, you're like, I can't use it. Your stuff's not open source. And people would get mad about that because like they're trying to promote their product. Right. So it was really, really important to make sure the expectations were set up front. And we did a pretty good job of it.
Got it. Well, then, so you built Presto at Facebook. It was a massive success. It started to see open source traction. Like what was the open source traction like when you, by the time you left Facebook? And did that matter to you? Were you sort of, tracking external committers as KPIs and the size of the community? And how did you think about the maturity of the project, not just in terms of the bits, but in terms of the community, as you mentioned?
So we definitely did not track the community as KPIs. And you can see that in the community that developed around it. Like we had what we thought was a diverse community of people involved, but it was really like just people in the Valley and a few startups that were actively involved in the product. And like the community wasn't actually that active. Like there was a Slack channel. We would talk on the Slack channel with people. We would help people out on their PRs, etc. So we thought we were doing a good job because we're measuring against our peers internally who are like basically over the wall kind of open source. And like lots of people were using it more than we expected. So we thought we were doing pretty good. Once we left Facebook, we decided really quickly that, so you can go look at our blog. We have a long blog post about why we left Facebook, but we left Facebook because Facebook the management team wanted to take more control of the open source project, and we weren't down for that. Like we originally set up the project to be, as I say, real open source. Like done open source for a very long time, and I've seen different versions of it. And to me, real open source is run by the people who are actually writing the software, not run by corporations or, run by a, I'll leave it there. But like run by the people who actually write the software. And so when it was like, oh, the management team was going to pick who the contributors were allowed to, contribute, like check in PRs and things like that. We're like, yeah, we're done. So we decided to go and leave Facebook, and we're like, we're going to have to like fork this and set up a new community. Well, first we tried to work with Facebook and they said, absolutely not. So we're like, fine, we'll have to set up our own thing. So we set up our own thing and we started like, hey, let's set up a Slack channel. Let's call everyone we know that actually is involved in this. And we very quickly found that the community was huge. Like, we're like, oh, this is mostly used in the US. And it's like, okay, so a third of the traffic came from Asia. We didn't know anyone over there who was using it. Like the distribution around the world was basically wherever there was tech, how much tech there was, that was the distribution. And so we started like talking to everyone. We went and helped out a bunch of companies, like improved their setups, started building community, tried to get more people involved in our community, really grew the Slack channel. Slack has been a huge thing for us. We do everything through it. We started doing, we had this company in Israel, Verada, invite us to a conference. They're like, we want to do a conference just for Presto. You want to come speak? And we showed up, and like literally it was a room for like, I don't know, 200 people. There were like people outside lined up, like watching on TV screens, standing outside. It was like, it was the craziest thing. We're like, how are there this many people in Tel Aviv who know about this? Like, it's a big city, but at the same time, like, what? And we just started repeating that. And through that, that year, we rebuilt the community, but it was way stronger. Like lots and lots of contributors from around, like lots of people being involved, really kind of grew the people using it. And it was very much time well spent. During that time, we didn't work for anyone. We spent like a year building a new community.
That was my next question. Yeah.
So everyone gets nervous because we're like the leaders of the project. Like between myself, Martine, and David, we wrote like a huge portion of this. And you're like, we're trying to build a real community here, and no one believes you. Like, if you're trying to like start a company at the same time. So we're like, we're just not going to do that. Like, we can figure that out later, what we're going to do. And our plan actually wasn't to start a company. We're actually going to go try and find another big company like Facebook who's just willing to pay us to work on it, because we just like writing a company is hard. Like, we're like, oh, we'll just find someone to help us out in what we want to do, and we'll just go make good money and write this stuff some more. So that really helped, because we would go and we talk to like, a big company, and they'd be like, yeah, but you guys are we're going to help you out. And then you're just going to take this and you're going to try and charge us. Like you've seen in some open source companies where it's like open source project where it's like, yep. And now nothing new is going to happen in the project. Like we've been, again, like I am a real big believer in like the communities run by the developers, the people who show up, they grow the software, and like, if some company has commercial advantage and someone comes along and writes the same version, it happens. Like, it happens to Starburst to this day. Like, we have some advantage, and then someone comes along and writes a new version. It's fine. It's just the way it goes.
And so then talk to me about how you sort of joined forces with Starburst. Like, how did that actually happen? Because you have a lot of like strong values about the way that the specific ways that open source needs to be open. And obviously that comes across in a lot of these stories, which is amazing. Tell us how that whole union ended up happening.
So Starburst, originally back in the day, there was a company called Adapt, which was the CEO of Starburst, Justin Boardman, and a bunch of engineers, plus Daniel Abadi, I think it was his idea. And they had a version of Hive where the backend storage was actually Postgres. And there's a bunch of papers on this. It's a very cool idea. Just doesn't scale, or it doesn't run very well in the cloud. And eventually they got bought by Teradata. And when they joined Teradata, they're like, our idea doesn't have legs. People aren't jumping on it. It's not it's just not what the community wants. And so they're like, what can we go work on? So they went and talked to the Hive people. They talked to a bunch of other groups, and they found what we were doing at Facebook with Presto. And within like, I don't know, a month or two from when we had open sourced it, they flew out to California, and we had a couple of meetings, and they decided that they were going to focus on commercializing around Presto. We were like, this is great. because at Facebook, there are all these things that just can't really get the resources to build that like commercial companies need, like really deep security integrations with like Facebook has one security system. There's one authentication system. So like building that stuff out, like we never had the time to do it. And so they were building that out in the community and they were reselling it through Teradata. And that worked for a while until Teradata decided that they were going to cut everything that wasn't making a lot of money. And they cut the Trino, the Presto stuff, and they cut like, there's a bunch of other like data luminaries that used to work there that no longer work there because they cut everything. And so after that, the folks who had built Adapt and then at Teradata, they're like, we're going to do a startup. And so they bootstrapped the startup for a while. After we left, they're like, you should come work with us. And we're like, yeah, but we can't do that because that'll freak everyone out. Like, and I'm not sure we want to do a startup, right? Later that year, after we're like, okay, we need to figure out what we're doing. We looked at a bunch of options and we had a bunch of long conversations with Justin around what we wanted to do, and sort of worked it out. But then Mike Volpe was like, this thing would be, Mike Volpe's one of our investors. He's the lead investor at Index. And he's like, this would be amazing if you two groups got together. He's like, I'm going to make that happen. And I'd known Mike and, you know, he wanted us to do something and like everyone wanted us to do something, but we're like, we don't want to do a startup because then we'll have to fight with like Starburst and Verada and all these other companies we like. Like, how do we actually do something and work it out? And so we eventually came to a deal with Starburst and it has worked out really well. And a lot of credit goes to Volpe, a lot of credit goes to Justin for like being able to like see what it looks like all put together. And the team is just amazing. It's great.
Yeah. That's cool. And so just to finish the last bit of it, you know, just so folks understand how sort of Presto became Trino, or a version of Presto became Trino. There's other big company dynamics that still exist inside Facebook that you sort of alluded to, that, you know, the powers that be sort of wanted to prevent you folks from using the Presto name. You know, let's say that's their right, regardless of where we personally stand on that. And so you renamed your fork ultimately to Trino, just for the clarity of the community. Yeah.
And it's one of those things where like we should have done it before. Like actually, like the idea that the names actually matter that much. Like my advice to everyone is like, they actually don't matter that much. What matters is the goodwill that comes from the community. And we should have probably changed the name long before. And it would have given us more time to build up the brand. And like, you know, and now we have this amazing new logo. And
I love the space bunny and, you know, like all the Trinoisms I'm seeing sort of like surrounding you. It looks like a very fun brand. Let's just say that.
Yes.
Probably belies the seriousness like below the covers.
It's funny because our original Presto brand is like really stodgy. And we're like, oh, we want to look like a traditional database company. And when we did the rebrand, I was like, let's do the opposite. Let's do something super fun. Like, you know, and we have this amazing designer and I'm like, this is all like traditional blue kind of IBM colors. Like, let's do something like pink and purple and like just out there. And they're all like, I don't know. I love it.
Well, it's I think I agree. It's refreshing and it's nice to have you know, sort of a different kind of a data point in the space. So Dane, you know, we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to hear from you sort of you know, some of the goodness that you've been working on recently, because I know there's Galaxy, which is hosted stuff. I know there's a roadmap for Trino that you're excited about. Talk to us a little bit about, you know, we got so much fun, like rich history, which was really enthralling,
Yeah.
and thank you for that. But I want to give you a chance to talk about some of
Yeah.
the technical stuff that you're really proud of, and you and your team have working on as well.
So for the past like year or so, we've been working on a SaaS hosted version of Trino at Starburst, and it's called Galaxy, and I love it. It's like, I love working on this project. So like in Trino, Trino's all about like running everywhere with everyone's stuff, right? And so like there's only so much the community can do. Like when you get to the edges of the project where you're like, oh, let's integrate with a security system, there are like 7 security systems in the world. And so like we can only build so much. Then there's plugins, but like each layer you go out, you get less and less of the community involved in it, to the point where like you'll have like one person who's using something, and they may go away and they may come back. And with Galaxy, we get the opportunity to like build out the whole system all the way out into like the edges, and like have a fully integrated experience. So it's like there's a fully integrated security system that like affects the whole system. Because we're only targeting just the clouds. So we're in 3 clouds, and we're able to like build these really deep integrations with the clouds, because we only need to run in like one environment, the Starburst environment, that like has very specific setup. So it's more like coding at Facebook, where there's one environment that you code to.
Yeah.
And whereas like Trino is like, there are like thousands of environments. There's really like, we have people using Trino who have like 20 LDAP systems that all have to be integrated into like the security system for login. You're like, why would you do that? Right. So like, I love this because we can actually like build out these deeper things that like the community just stops at, and that are like super interesting and fun. So like, there's this whole like integrated experience. Like anyone who's interested in Trino should definitely go try it out. You can sign up in like a couple of minutes, and boom, you're just online and working, which is, I don't have to explain to people how to set everything up and install it and connect to other things. Like it just kind of does it for you. So it's something I've been really excited about, because I think it lowers the bar for like using Trino, and I want more people using it. Like I love this software.
So your
I'm
data,
super excited.
with Galaxy, does your data sort of sit like in its existing place, and this is a managed control plane? This is sort of the control plane idea that we're starting to see emerge in other sort of cloud hosted data systems.
Yeah. So we connect to the data in your cloud account. So we'll connect to like your object storage or your MySQLs or Redshift or like whatever you have, and you're able to run queries over it. We handle managing the compute. We handle the security. We'll integrate into your security, we're just finishing up our SSO integration. So we'll integrate into the SSO and things like that. So like the idea is like, you bring the data, we'll hook everything else up, and it just works for you, and it's secure, and it's, reliable and not complicated.
Awesome.
Like, we spend a lot of time trying to make Trino easy to set up, and it is, but it is still very hard.
Got it. Well, that sounds like a very cool product, and I'm sure lots of folks in our community will find it useful. And talk to us a little bit about the roadmap. Like, do you see as CTO, do you see the commercial roadmap different than the open source roadmap? Do you try to control both? Like, talk to me a little bit about how you see that, and what we have to look forward to on either or both sides.
So on the commercial roadmap, I mostly focus on our SaaS product. We have an on-prem product also. And most of our stuff on the commercial roadmap is improving this overall experience and helping, make it easier to connect in your data and make it secure and reliable and all that sort of stuff. So it's like I think it is like the icing on top of like the Trino, right? On the open source side, obviously we do not control the roadmap. That's the community. We have a bunch of developers that are working on stuff that we're interested in Starburst. So some of the stuff I'm really excited about is this granular fault tolerance stuff that we've been working on. It's led by Andre, which is a person who used to work at Hadapt back in the day, and then went to Facebook, and now is building this stuff at Starburst for the community. And it basically allows us to run very large batch jobs, completely fault tolerant at Trino speeds. So these very large jobs are not going to be a problem. Or actually, I think it's all in now. I think they said they checked it in yesterday, and it's in a release. So it's pretty awesome, and I'm excited for the new a new execution scheduling model, and I'm curious to see how much farther we can go. We have stuff around. There's a bunch of new awesome features in SQL that like not everyone knows about. So there's this thing called polymorphic table functions, which allows you to integrate things like in the middle of your query, you can be like, process these rows through this function, which takes rows and transforms and output new rows. And the function itself can be like, I'm a Python script, and when I process the rows, the output schema is this. That's why they're called polymorphic, because they can change the output based on what's in the script. And so it allows you to integrate things like scripts or raw SQL pass-through or complex non-relational things like, approximate top end things, or heck, you probably even put machine learning into it if you're clever enough. So it's just, what I like about it is it's a very powerful thing that opens up the creativity of the community to figure out like, okay, we have this place where we plug this in. What can we do with this? Right.
And this is part of the ANSI standard.
Yes. Yeah. It's been in there for 2 years or something like that. There are all these like one of the other things is like there's these new JSON functions that are like super awesome that like not a lot of people know about. So like we very closely follow the specs. I mean, I love specs all the way back to my EJB days. So like we follow the specs, and there's like some really, really awesome ideas in there, and we're implementing them as we can. The other big thing is we're moving to Java 17 soon, and it's such a better programming experience. Anyone who's used it, like it will blow your mind. It's like another game changer. Like the Java team has done something really amazing here. And part of that is there's this new vectorization SIMD system. So we're starting to invest in, in trying to figure out how we can do more SIMD stuff. Like we've done a bunch of experimentation. There's, which can improve some computations considerably. There we go.
There we are. I lost you for a second. Sorry about that.
So it can improve some computation, some parts of the computation, like a couple of X. It's very interesting how you actually get it into a system and pull it off and make it efficient and actually work. There's a million papers in the data space about using SIMD, and not a lot of people are using it because the reality is when you get it into a big system, it doesn't work very well. But there are ways to pull it off, and where we've done some experiments, and we'll see more over the next year. So I'm pretty excited about what's going on in that space.
Very cool. Well, thanks for sharing with us some of what we have to look forward to as a community in future versions of Trino. And Dane, it's been really awesome to have you. I need to let you get back to work because we could talk like this all morning. And the stories that you have from who you've worked with and what you've seen in the past is really like tickling to me because I've been in tech for a long time as well. I was more on the East Coast side, and so it's great to hear about some of these Bay Area stories. So thanks for your contribution to the open source world, and I can tell your passion and your fire for it really drives you. So I think and I hope that you found the best place for you, the Starburst, and I know that they'll be a good steward of the resources that they throw against the Trino project, and I'm sure you're happy to see that. And you're also welcoming to the rest of the community to continue to contribute and support the project, which is amazing. So thanks for your enthusiasm for open source. It's really been great to have you on the show.
I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
And thanks to our listeners. Make sure you don't miss Data Council Austin, which is next week. It's going to be our largest event ever. So please make sure and join us IRL. And as far as DC Thursday, we'll have our next event on April 7th, where we'll be talking about feature engineering with Patrick Thompson from Rasgo. So don't forget to